Sarah Martinez never thought she would end up in the middle of a war zone. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she dreamed of becoming a nurse to help people. Her father worked at the local factory, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Money was always tight, but Sarah's parents saved every penny they could for her education. When Sarah turned 18, she faced a difficult choice. Her family couldn't afford college, and student loans seemed impossible to pay back. That's when a military recruiter visited her high school. He talked about free medical training, steady pay, and the chance to serve her country. Sarah listened carefully as he explained how she could become a combat medic. "You'll save lives," the recruiter told her. "Real lives. People who depend on you in the most dangerous situations." Sarah signed up that same week. Her parents were worried but proud. They knew their daughter had always been brave and caring. Even as a child, she would bandage her friends' scraped knees and comfort anyone who was hurt. Basic training was harder than anything Sarah had ever experienced. She ran miles in the desert heat, learned to shoot weapons she never imagined holding, and studied medical procedures under pressure. Some nights she collapsed into her bunk, wondering if she had made the right choice. But Sarah pushed through. She graduated at the top of her medical training class. Her instructors noted her calm behavior under stress and her natural ability to think quickly in emergencies. They recommended her for advanced combat medic training. During advanced training, Sarah met other medics who had served overseas. They told her stories about treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Some talked about the friends they had saved. Others spoke quietly about the ones they couldn't help. Sarah listened to everything, knowing that soon she would face these same challenges. One instructor, a gruff sergeant with 20 years of experience, pulled Sarah aside after a particularly intense training exercise. "Martinez," he said, "you've got something special. When everything goes wrong, you stay focused. That's going to save lives someday." Sarah didn't feel special. She felt nervous and uncertain about what lay ahead, but she also felt ready to do her job. She had trained for months to handle medical emergencies in combat situations. She knew how to treat gunshot wounds, stop bleeding, and keep injured soldiers alive until they could reach a hospital. The day finally came when Sarah received her deployment orders. She was assigned to work with a Navy SEAL team in Afghanistan. These were some of the most elite soldiers in the military, known for taking on the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Sarah's family gathered to say goodbye at the airport. Her mother cried and made her promise to stay safe. Her father shook her hand and told her he was proud of her. Her younger brother gave her a small cross necklace that had belonged to their grandmother. As Sarah's plane took off, she looked down at the familiar landscape of her hometown getting smaller below. She thought about the training that had brought her to this moment and the unknown challenges waiting for her. She touched the cross around her neck and whispered a prayer for strength and wisdom. What Sarah didn't know was that in just a few weeks, she would face a situation that would test everything she had learned and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most ordinary places. The heat in Afghanistan hit Sarah like a wall when she stepped off the transport plane. Even at dawn, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day. She grabbed her medical bags and looked around at the dusty military base that would be her home for the next year. Within hours of arriving, Sarah met her new team. The 3 Navy SEALs she would be working with were unlike any soldiers she had encountered during training. Marcus Thompson, the team leader, was a quiet man with sharp eyes who seemed to notice everything around him. James Rodriguez had a quick smile but moved with the precise confidence of someone who had seen many dangerous missions. David Kim was the youngest of the 3, but his calm demeanor showed he was already a seasoned warrior. At first, the SEALs were polite but distant. They had worked with medics before, but Sarah was different. She was smaller than most of the men they had served with, and some whispered that she looked too young and inexperienced for the dangerous work ahead. Sarah heard the whispers but didn't let them bother her. She knew she would have to prove herself through actions, not words. The team's first mission together was supposed to be routine. Intelligence reports indicated a small group of enemy fighters was hiding in a village about 20 miles from the base. The SEALs were tasked with gathering information and, if possible, capturing one of the leaders for questioning. Sarah spent the evening before the mission carefully packing her medical supplies. She checked and double-checked her equipment, making sure she had everything needed to treat various types of injuries. Marcus watched her methodical preparation and nodded approvingly. "Good," he said simply. "Preparation saves lives." The team left the base before sunrise, traveling in a heavily armored vehicle across the rocky terrain. Sarah had never been outside the wire before, and everything felt different from training. The landscape was more barren and hostile than she had imagined. The silence between the team members was tense but focused. As they approached the target village, Marcus received an update over the radio. The enemy fighters had been spotted moving toward a different location. The mission was changing. Instead of a simple reconnaissance, they might now face active combat. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but she forced herself to stay calm. She thought about her training and reminded herself that she was ready for whatever might happen. She checked her medical supplies one more time and made sure her own weapon was ready just in case. The village appeared quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. Marcus held up his hand, signaling the team to stop and listen. The only sounds were the wind blowing through empty buildings and the distant call of a bird. Something felt wrong. The SEALs moved forward carefully, using hand signals to communicate. Sarah stayed close behind, watching for any signs of danger. They searched several buildings without finding anyone. It seemed like the entire village had been abandoned. Then James spotted movement on a rooftop across the square. He raised his weapon and peered through his scope. What he saw made his blood run cold. This wasn't a small group of enemy fighters. It was a much larger force, and they were setting up an ambush. "Contact," Marcus shouted into his radio, but the response was filled with static. They were cut off from base communications and surrounded by an unknown number of enemy fighters. The mission had just become a fight for survival. Sarah crouched behind a stone wall and listened to the rapid exchange between the SEALs. They were discussing their options, but none of them looked good. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and far from any backup. In a few minutes, Sarah would face her first real combat situation, and everything she had trained for would be put to the ultimate test. The first shots came from everywhere at once. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall as bullets whistled overhead and struck the ground around her. The sound was deafening, nothing like the controlled noise of training exercises. This was real combat, and people were trying to kill her. Marcus immediately took charge, shouting orders to his team while returning fire at the enemy positions. "David, take the left flank. James, cover the right. We need to find better cover." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She scanned the area for wounded team members while staying low to avoid the incoming fire. Her heart was pounding, but her mind remained clear and focused on her job. She was here to keep these men alive no matter what happened. The gunfight lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The SEALs fought with incredible skill, moving from position to position and coordinating their fire to keep the enemy at bay. But Sarah could see they were gradually being pushed back toward a cluster of damaged buildings with no easy escape route. Then she heard the sound that every medic dreads. "Medic!" James called out from behind a pile of rubble. His voice was strained and urgent. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her medical bag and crawled across the open ground toward his position, ignoring the bullets that struck the dirt around her. James had been hit in the shoulder by a piece of shrapnel from an exploding grenade. Blood was soaking through his uniform and his left arm hung uselessly at his side. Sarah quickly assessed the wound and began applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "How bad is it?" James asked through gritted teeth. "You'll live," Sarah replied, working quickly to bandage the wound. "But you need to stay down and let me finish this." Before she could complete the bandaging, another explosion rocked their position. David's voice came from across the courtyard, filled with pain and desperation. "I'm hit. I'm hit bad." Sarah looked toward David's position and saw him lying motionless behind an overturned cart. Marcus was pinned down by enemy fire and couldn't reach him. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her medical supplies and sprinted across 30 yards of open ground, while bullets flew around her. David had been struck by multiple rounds in his legs and abdomen. He was conscious but losing blood quickly. Sarah immediately went to work, applying tourniquets to his legs and pressure bandages to his stomach. The wounds were severe, and she knew he needed surgery soon or he wouldn't survive. "Stay with me, David," she said firmly while working on his injuries. "You're going to be okay, but I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me." David nodded weakly. "My wife. She's having a baby next month," he whispered. "Then you better make sure you're there to meet your child," Sarah replied, never stopping her work on his wounds. Marcus's voice cut through the gunfire. "Sarah, we've got movement on the north side. They're trying to flank us." Sarah looked up to see enemy fighters moving through the buildings toward their position. The SEALs were running out of ammunition and options. Soon they would be overrun and everyone would be captured or killed. That's when Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't carry David to safety alone, and James was too wounded to help. But she could give them a chance to survive if she was willing to take an enormous risk. She grabbed her rifle and positioned herself between the wounded SEALs and the approaching enemy fighters. Sarah had never fired her weapon in combat before, but she remembered her training. She took careful aim and began returning fire, buying precious time for Marcus to reposition and help with the wounded. The enemy fighters were surprised to face resistance from their direction and temporarily fell back. This gave Marcus the opening he needed to reach James and help him move to a more defensible position. But Sarah knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The enemy would regroup and attack again, and next time they might not be so lucky. The situation was getting worse by the minute. Sarah could hear the enemy fighters regrouping and calling to each other in the surrounding buildings. They were coordinating a final assault that would overwhelm the small American team. David was fading in and out of consciousness. James could barely use his wounded arm, and Marcus was running dangerously low on ammunition. Sarah knelt beside David and checked his pulse. It was getting weaker and his breathing was becoming shallow. The tourniquets had stopped most of the bleeding from his legs, but she suspected internal injuries that she couldn't treat in the field. He needed immediate evacuation to a surgical facility, but that seemed impossible given their current situation. "Marcus," Sarah called out, "David needs a helicopter evacuation right now, or we're going to lose him." Marcus shook his head grimly. "Radio's been dead for 30 minutes. Even if I could call for help, no chopper could land here with all this enemy fire." Sarah looked around their position. They were trapped in a small courtyard surrounded by damaged buildings. The enemy controlled all the high ground and had them pinned down from multiple directions. The only way out was through a narrow alley that led toward open ground, but it was completely exposed to enemy fire. That's when Sarah remembered something from her medical training. Sometimes, when a patient is dying and conventional treatment isn't working, a medic has to take extraordinary risks to save a life. The same principle might apply to their current tactical situation. "What if we create a diversion?" Sarah suggested. "Something big enough to draw their attention away from that alley." Marcus looked at her curiously. "What do you have in mind?" Sarah pointed to an old fuel barrel she had noticed earlier near one of the damaged buildings. "If we can get that barrel into the right position and detonate it, it might create enough chaos for us to move the wounded." James, despite his injury, managed a weak smile. "That's either brilliant or completely crazy." "Maybe both," Sarah admitted. "But David doesn't have much time left and we can't stay here indefinitely." Marcus considered the plan for a moment. It was risky, but their alternatives were limited. "Okay," he decided. "Here's what we'll do. I'll provide covering fire while you position the barrel. James, even wounded, you're still our best shot. Can you hit that barrel from here once Sarah gets it in position?" James nodded, checking his rifle with his good arm. "Just get me a clear shot." Sarah studied the route to the fuel barrel. She would have to cross about 20 feet of open ground, move the heavy barrel into position, and get back to cover before the enemy realized what she was doing. It seemed almost impossible, but David's life depended on someone taking this chance. She took several deep breaths to calm her nerves and checked her equipment one more time. "When I give the signal, James takes the shot. As soon as that barrel explodes, we move David toward the alley. Everyone understand?" The three SEALs nodded. Despite being wounded and outnumbered, they trusted Sarah's plan completely. In the past few hours, she had proven herself to be much more than just a medic. She was a full member of their team, willing to risk everything to save her teammates. Sarah waited for a brief lull in the enemy fire, then sprinted toward the fuel barrel. She could hear bullets striking the ground behind her, but she focused only on reaching her target. The barrel was heavier than she expected, but adrenaline gave her the strength to roll it into position near a pile of rubble, where the explosion would create maximum disruption. As she ran back toward cover, Sarah could see enemy fighters starting to realize what she was doing. They began concentrating their fire on her position, making her final sprint back to the team incredibly dangerous. She dove behind the stone wall just as bullets began striking exactly where she had been standing. "Now," Sarah shouted to James. James took careful aim despite his wounded shoulder and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the fuel barrel perfectly, causing a massive explosion that sent flames and debris flying in all directions. The enemy fighters were temporarily blinded and disoriented by the blast. "Move, move," Marcus commanded, and Sarah immediately began dragging David toward the alley while James and Marcus provided covering fire. This was their only chance to escape, and everything depended on the next few minutes. The explosion had worked better than Sarah hoped. Thick black smoke filled the air and she could hear confused shouting from the enemy positions. But she knew this advantage would only last a few minutes before they regrouped and resumed their attack. Dragging David through the alley was the hardest physical challenge Sarah had ever faced. He was unconscious now, and his full weight seemed to increase with every step. The rough ground scraped against his back, but Sarah had no choice except to keep moving. Behind her, she could hear Marcus and James fighting a running battle with the enemy fighters who were beginning to pursue them. Halfway through the alley, David's breathing became extremely labored. Sarah stopped and checked his pulse again. It was very weak and irregular. The internal bleeding was getting worse, and she realized he might not survive much longer without immediate surgery. "David," she said firmly, trying to keep him conscious. "Stay with me. Think about your wife and your baby." David's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Can't feel my legs," he whispered. Sarah's heart sank. This could mean spinal damage in addition to his other injuries. But she pushed these fears aside and focused on keeping him alive until they could reach help. She adjusted his position to protect his neck and spine, then continued dragging him toward the end of the alley. Marcus appeared beside her, breathing heavily from the firefight. "How is he?" "Bad," Sarah replied honestly. "We need to get him to a hospital in the next hour or we're going to lose him." Marcus grabbed David's other arm and together they moved him faster through the remaining distance. James followed behind them, still managing to provide covering fire despite his wounded shoulder. The teamwork between all four of them was remarkable, each person doing whatever was necessary to help the others survive. They emerged from the alley into open terrain that offered no cover, but was their only route toward potential rescue. Sarah could see their vehicle in the distance, but it looked damaged from the earlier fighting. Even if they reached it, she wasn't sure it would still run. "There." James pointed toward a ridge about half a mile away. "I can see dust clouds. That might be our backup finally arriving." Sarah looked where he was pointing and saw several military vehicles approaching their position. Marcus immediately began signaling with a mirror he carried for emergencies, flashing reflected sunlight toward the approaching convoy to identify their location. But the enemy fighters had also seen the approaching vehicles and were now racing to cut off the Americans before they could reach safety. Sarah realized they were about to be caught in the open ground between two forces, with David too injured to move quickly and James barely able to fight. "We're not going to make it carrying David," Marcus said grimly. "They'll catch us before we reach the convoy." Sarah looked at the approaching enemy fighters, then at David's pale face. She had trained for months to save lives in impossible situations, and she wasn't about to give up now. A crazy idea formed in her mind, something so dangerous that no reasonable person would attempt it. "Give me your radio," she told Marcus. "I'm going to try something." Marcus handed her the radio, confused about what she was planning. Sarah adjusted the frequency to the emergency channel used by all American forces in the area. "Any American aircraft in the vicinity?" she broadcast. "This is Combat Medic Martinez requesting immediate close air support. We have 3 wounded personnel being pursued by enemy forces. Our position is marked by mirror flashes on the ridge line." For several long seconds, there was only static. Then a voice crackled through the radio that made Sarah's heart leap with hope. "Medic Martinez, this is Apache 27. I see your mirror flashes and have eyes on the enemy pursuit. Can you mark your exact position with smoke?" Sarah looked around desperately. She didn't have any smoke grenades, but she remembered something from her survival training. She pulled out an emergency flare from her medical kit, the kind used to signal for help in extreme situations. "Stand by for red flare," she radioed back, then ignited the flare and held it high above her head. "I see your red flare," the Apache pilot responded. "Keep your heads down." "We're coming in hot." The sound of the approaching helicopter gunship was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. But she knew they still had to survive the next few minutes while the enemy fighters closed in on their position. The Apache helicopter appeared over the ridge like an angel of salvation. Sarah had never been so happy to see an aircraft in her life. The pilot's voice came through the radio, clear and confident. "Medic Martinez, I count approximately 15 enemy fighters approaching your position from the northwest. We're going to lay down suppressing fire, but you need to move toward the friendly convoy immediately. Sarah looked at David, who was barely breathing now. His skin was pale and cold to the touch, classic signs of severe blood loss and shock. She knew he had only minutes left unless they could get him to a surgical team. The Apache's guns opened fire with a thunderous roar that echoed across the desert. The enemy fighters scattered for cover as explosions erupted around their positions. This was the chance Sarah and her team had been waiting for. "Move!" Marcus shouted, and all four of them began running toward the approaching convoy vehicles. Sarah and Marcus carried David between them while James followed. Despite his wounded shoulder, every step was a struggle, but they pushed forward knowing this was their only opportunity to escape. The friendly convoy was closer now, close enough that Sarah could see the medics setting up a casualty collection point. Her heart filled with hope as she realized they might actually make it to safety. But David's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Halfway to the convoy, he stopped breathing completely. Sarah immediately laid him on the ground and began performing CPR, pressing rhythmically on his chest while giving him rescue breaths. "Come on, David," she said firmly between compressions. "Your baby needs you. Don't you dare give up now." Marcus and James formed a protective circle around her, while she worked frantically to revive their teammate. The Apache continued providing air support, but Sarah was completely focused on the life-or-death struggle happening in her hands. After what felt like an eternity, David suddenly gasped and began breathing again. His pulse was weak but steady. Sarah had bought him precious time, but she knew he still needed immediate surgery to survive. The convoy medics reached them, just as Sarah was checking David's vital signs one more time. They immediately took over his care, starting IV fluids and preparing him for rapid transport to the nearest field hospital. Sarah briefed them quickly on his injuries and the treatment she had provided. "Excellent work," the senior medic told her. "Your field treatment probably saved his life." As David was loaded into the medical evacuation helicopter, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had been building for hours. Her uniform was covered in blood and dirt, her hands were shaking from adrenaline, and every muscle in her body ached from the physical demands of the fight. James sat down beside her, cradling his wounded arm. "You know," he said quietly, "when we first met you, some of us wondered if you were tough enough for this job." Sarah managed a tired smile. "And now? Now I'd follow you into any fight," James replied. "You've got more courage than most of the soldiers I've served with." Marcus approached them with news about David's condition. "The doctors say he's going to make it. He'll need several surgeries and months of rehabilitation, but he's going to live. His wife will get to introduce him to their new baby." 3 weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the base. David Kim walked slowly into the medical tent, supported by crutches but very much alive. His wife was with him, holding a beautiful newborn baby girl. "I wanted you to meet someone," David said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is Emma Sarah Kim. We named her middle name after the person who made sure I would be here to meet her." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she looked at the tiny baby. All the danger, fear, and exhaustion of that terrible day seemed worth it in this moment. She had kept her promise to save lives, and now a father would watch his daughter grow up. The military awarded Sarah a Bronze Star for valor, but the real reward was knowing that her actions had kept 3 families from losing someone they loved. The girl from small-town Texas who had joined the military to get an education had become something more than she ever imagined possible. She had become a hero, proving that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary courage when lives depend on their actions.